Hello, everyone. I'm Penny Cook, President and CEO for Pioneer Network, and I'm so pleased to have you with us for the final webinar in our Sharing the Vision series. The webinars in this series are approximately 45 minutes long, with additional time for questions and answers. Our goal is to present topics and start conversations that will inform and inspire you as we work together to pioneer a new culture of aging. In this series, we aim to bring more people into the discussion about ageism, how it impacts our lives, our work, and how both individually and together we can help put an end to ageism. You're welcome to ask questions using the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll do our best to address them either during the webinar or at the end. There will be plenty of time for questions and answers. And so, let's begin. I'm very pleased to introduce today our guest, Jill Vitale Aussem. She is both a colleague and friend of mine, and she's the president and the CEO of the Eden Alternative. Jill, we're so pleased to have you as part of our webinar series on ageism.
Thank you, Penny. It is so great to be here with everyone today. And I know there has been a series of webinars on the topics of ageism and ableism, so I'm not going to be going too deep into those concepts, as I know the audience has already learned about a lot of that. What we're going to talk about today is something a little bit different, though. You know, a lot of times we think about ageism and ableism, and we think about this huge, overwhelming task of trying to change our world and our society, and the way we think about aging, and the way we think about people living with different abilities. And actually, for those of us who work in the aging services field, the work starts much closer to home. And that's what we are going to focus on today, is the way that ageism and ableism impact senior living settings. And I work for the Eden Alternative now, but I have 2 decades of experience in running these communities in the past, and have learned a lot along the way from kind of what I saw happening in my community. And what I want to start with, Penny, if you could pop it up there, is to just do a little poll. And there are a couple of questions that Penny will be putting up on the screen here. So 2 questions for our audience members. The first question is, are ageism and ableism impacting the people that live and work in your community? Yes, definitely, somewhat, or nope, not at all. And do you educate the residents and team members of your community about ageism and ableism? So yes, we educate both residents and team members. We educate only residents, we educate only team members, or we haven't done any education yet. And that's okay too. I just want to get an idea of where people are with that. So if you could all pop up your answers to those questions, and Penny will tell us how things came out with this poll.
I see that they're still coming in, so let's keep it open for another 15 seconds or so. Okay, so we're going to close the poll. And you should be able to see the results, Jill.
Great, thank you so much. So we've got, so the vast majority of people, 79% said yes, definitely, it's impacting the people that live and work in the community. 21% said somewhat, and nobody said nope, not at all. So that's the first key, is having awareness of what's going on. And then as far as education goes, this is really great, actually better than I usually see in organizations, probably because of the people who are on this call are movers and shakers and innovators, but 36% said they educate both residents and team members. Nobody said they only educate residents. 14% said they only educate team members, and 50% haven't done any education yet. And again, that's okay. That's why we're here today, to talk about this. So thank you all for participating in that poll. And let's get started. So as I said when I first got started talking to you today, you know, the change starts here. The change starts with us. We are, those of us who work in this field are in the perfect position to start driving the way we see aging and the way we see people living with different abilities. And what really it starts to happen, and we're going to talk a little bit about ageism and ableism, is that there's this huge intersection that happens in our communities with ageism and ableism. And I remember it was probably like 5 or 6 years ago, and I was the executive director of a continuing care or life plan community that has independent living residents, assisted living, nursing home, memory support. And the Eden Alternative had a webinar with Dr. Bill Thomas, and he talked about ageism. And this was back before everybody was talking about this. As always, he's always way ahead of everybody else. But I remember being on that call and hearing him talk about how, you know, ageism should be no more acceptable, socially acceptable than racism or sexism, and what are we doing about it in our communities? And that was the first time that it really ever occurred to me. And I really started looking at what was happening in my community. And I was concerned about what I saw. And a few years later, I was part of the Leading Age Leadership Academy. That's a big year-long leadership deep dive. And one of the things that we did is we split up into teams, and our team, for a year, we were to work on what we saw as a gap, something that wasn't being addressed in our field and was having serious consequences and needed to be addressed. And our team identified ageism and ableism in our communities. So what I'm going to be talking with you about today are some of the things that we experienced in my community as we started to really look at things, and what my Leadership Academy team found out when we all started digging into it in our own communities as well. And, you know, I don't know if anybody has shared this definition of ageism in any of the other webinars that have been done, but I really like this. This is from Todd Nelson. This is his definition of ageism, that it's prejudice against our feared future self. And I think this definition makes perfect sense in our communities, where a lot of what happens is people being afraid, who are older, being afraid of living with frailty or living with dementia. And so all the things start to come into play. When there's fear, we tend to push whatever we're afraid of aside. So I encourage you to keep that definition in mind as we move ahead, because it really starts to make a lot of sense. And then, of course, there's ableism, and just a really quick review of that. That's prejudice or discrimination against someone who's living with different cognitive or physical abilities. And again, this is where we really start to see these things really intersect in our communities and create a lot of issues. And so when I started working with my community about this, one of the elders that lived in the community, named Sue, was a cartoonist. And she decided she wanted to draw some cartoons of the things that she saw happening in our community when it came to ageism and ableism. So, you know, here's a picture of a man with a walker, and two people saying, "I didn't come here to live with old people." I'm sure a lot of people have heard that. And I used to hear that a lot from people who were moving in or thinking of moving in, and somebody else saying, "See, here's another one with a walker. Why are they letting all these old people in here?" Another one with an elder who's confused, can't find her apartment, and somebody saying, "She shouldn't be living here. She's so confused." And then finally, this is her other cartoon, and these double doors on this slide depict those, you know, the fire doors that we always have that go into a nursing home or memory support, the different levels of living in a community, and people saying, "Shoot me if I ever have to go there," because of that stigma around needing extra support and services in a community. And in my community at the time, there was, and I use the term independent living because that's the commonly used term. Dr. Bill Thomas reminds us that nobody is truly independent unless you're living off the grid and growing your own food and not using electricity or any services. We're all interdependent. But the independent living, as we called it, was called the living center. And the residents that lived there called the nursing home the dying center. And that was just kind of the culture that we had. It was a wonderful community. but there was big segregation going on. There was even this tunnel that ran from the nursing home to the rest of the community. And, there were even stories about a ghost that lurked in the tunnel. And people would go to the nursing home to see like a family member or something, or maybe to volunteer to help somebody, but there wasn't equal kind of relationships, I wouldn't say, there. So that was something we also really started thinking about and looking at. Our Leadership Academy, when we were all working together in my team, the folks on my team went out and interviewed people in their communities, and I'm going to share just a few of the quotes from those residents that were especially impactful to us as we did this work. So a woman named Helen, who lived in assisted living in a retirement community, said, "They," meaning the other residents, "seem to be looking at me, but really they're looking over me." Sally said, "I go where I want and I do what I want. They," meaning the independent living residents, "don't like it, and that's tough. I am a person and I have a right to go wherever I want. I have wheels and they have legs, but we are all the same." And Patricia said, "I'm shy about who I eat with because I can't use my fork and spoon. I sometimes choose to eat alone because I know eating with my hands can be upsetting to some." And a family member at a community that had a very inclusive culture shared her story about how hard it was to find a place for her parents. And she said, "Other communities wanted to be a showcase where only youthful, healthy seniors were displayed. People racked by the tremors of Parkinson's, debilitated by dementia, or simply gnarled by age were made to feel they were an embarrassment, beings unfit to be seen in public." So when we really went out and started looking at our communities and then talking to the people that live there and their family members, it really validated what we saw, which was that cruel irony, which is the title of this webinar today. And that is, with all of the ageism and ableism in our society that people face, if there's one place that we should be free from that, if we're living with frailty or living with dementia, it should be a senior living community, right? A retirement community. But that's not what we were seeing in the majority of our communities and what we were seeing in the field in general. And there have been a number of stories. So here are some examples from the New York Times. There was a big story. It was a number of years ago, but the article is called "Tables Reserved for the Healthiest." And this was about a community where people who lived in the nursing home were not allowed to dine in the main dining room with the independent living residents. That actually ended up being a lawsuit because of ADA violations and things like that. I think it ended up being settled, but this is, I think some of that's changed, but this has been pretty common, that people have to dine and do things where they live and not interact with other people. Mean Girls in the Retirement Community was written by Jennifer Weiner, who's a popular author, and she told the story about her Nana moving into a community and the mean girls in the community, she called them. And what she said is, it's people who were a certain age were prejudiced against the people who were older than them, and just kind of how that culture felt to her Nana and to her. And then another story, an unexpected bingo call, you can't play, was about a community where someone who needed a higher level of care first wasn't allowed to play bingo because of policies. And then the residents really told the person, well, you can't play with us anymore because you need more help. So this has been out there in the public eye as well. And here's the thing. The people that live in our communities and the people that are in those stories aren't bad people at all. The system is working exactly the way we set it up to work. People are behaving in these communities, taking cues from the way our organizations have set things up. So I was talking to somebody about this whole issue, and she said, It's working exactly the way we set it up. We segregate older people from the rest of society in these communities, and then we segregate people based on their care needs. And so really, the folks that live in our communities are really just acting according to the norms that are in existence with the way the organization is set up. So what I've really seen happening is this cycle, right, where there's a stigma about frailty. There's a stigma about using a walker, right? People won't get walkers when maybe it could help them be, have better mobility. They don't want to get hearing aids because nobody wants to admit that they're older and can't hear. People don't want to, they're terrified of living with dementia. So there's this stigma, there's this fear, and then based on that fear, we segregate people. Either the organization does it based on their care needs, or people start to do it themselves, like ostracizing people, marginalizing people, pushing them off to the side. You can't sit here anymore. I don't want to be with this person because she can't remember anything, which then reinforces the stigma, which causes more fear, which leads to more of that. So this is the cycle we have to stop as communities, and really focus on this and work on this. And the other thing that we saw in my team and with the Leadership Academy, when we looked at things, and when I really started looking at what I was seeing in my community and other communities, is that there are organizational or institutional structures that are really perpetuating this as well. And so one is how we approach sales and marketing. I was taught from the time I entered this field that you don't, if somebody's coming to live in your community, assisted living or independent living, you don't show them a higher level of care than they need because it scares people. So one of my first jobs was in a retirement community, and the person who trained me said, never, ever, ever take the person to the nursing home because nobody wants to see that. Right? And so we're perpetuating that stigma by making it something that people are terrified of. And there's also a tendency to market our communities and really focus on all these pictures of people who are out riding their bikes and waving and really only showing that one side of being older. That can really serve to stigmatize those people who are living with different abilities. Our policies and procedures sometimes play a role. So do we have rules that if you live in this certain area of the community, you can only dine in this community? Do we have separate activity, like community life programs? Like, I never really understood when I started looking at this, why do we have separate calendars for folks who live in independent living and assisted living and the nursing home, and why are we doing this? So there's all those kinds of policies and procedures that come into place, the things we're doing. Budget, when I started looking at that, I realized, oh my gosh, we had a much lower per resident per day cost budgeted for food in the nursing home. And, I asked a whole bunch of people about this, like, why is that? And, there were some answers like people in independent living, they have more choices. But there weren't a lot of answers as to why that was the case. And so that's another thing, like, why would we have a lower budgeted food cost for people in the nursing home? It doesn't make sense to me now that I really look at it. And I visited a community a few years ago, and we were there in a group, and the dining services director was telling us how great it was because everybody in the community has the same food options, menu options. And so I was like really excited about that until he said, of course we use a cheaper cut of meat in the nursing home. And I thought, wow. And we don't even question these things. And then the other thing that I really started to notice in my community and in other communities when I would go for tours is everything would be pristine in the independent living part of the community. Touch-up paint, everything's looking perfect. And then you go through those double doors into a higher level of care and things kind of look shabby. And so it all just starts to say is, are we really valuing people who are living with frailty, living with dementia, when all these different things are in place? And here's what I've really come to believe very strongly is we can't fight ageism without addressing ableism. And again, one of the things that I think is a great thing is, you know, all of the movement for wellness and healthy living and successful aging is awesome, because we all want to live a healthier life as we get older. What can tend to happen sometimes is we are putting out these super agers, the people who are running marathons or water skiing or whatever it might be. What can happen is when we're doing all that and labeling that as successful aging, what does that make the majority of the rest of the people who are living with frailty, who are living with dementia? And successful aging looks different for everyone, but we don't often show what successful aging looks like for somebody who's living with dementia or somebody who's in a wheelchair. And so I think we just need to really broaden that, because if we are fighting ageism by just showing these images, we're actually increasing ableism, because those people aren't living up to that bar of successful aging. So there's a big impact to all of this. As people live in communities, whether they're segregated and live in the nursing home and nobody ever wants to go there and nobody wants to tour through that area, or they're living in their apartment home in independent living or assisted living, and they're ostracized or marginalized by their friends or the other people that live there because they're afraid. And they don't, or maybe they don't know how to support someone living with dementia. So what happens is people become isolated. Either they are isolated by other people or they self-isolate because they are not feeling like they are welcomed and part of the whole. And we know this, right? So isolation, there's a 45% increased risk of mortality in seniors who report feeling lonely. And loneliness is more dangerous than obesity and as damaging as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And so other research studies have shown, just moving into a community doesn't mean you're not isolated or not lonely. There have actually been studies that found a significant number of people living in senior living settings are still isolated and are still lonely. And I think ageism and ableism really play into that for people. So here's a call to action that came from one of the folks that we interviewed as part of our Leadership Academy work. And this was Patricia. And I will always remember that reading this after this interview was done. Patricia said, "Help us to trust that we will continue to be accepted even when our hands and words stop working. Help us to believe that our friends will always be our friends." That was her call to action to the leadership of her community. And I think that's a great call to action for all of us. So there's a saying that what we permit, we promote. And so when I say this, I'm not talking about, as an executive director, you have to crack down on things. I'm saying what a culture, what an organization permits to happen, they're promoting. So if we don't address ageism and ableism and people being marginalized and ostracized because of their abilities, we're basically promoting that culture, and it's self-perpetuating, and it will just continue and it will just get stronger. So what we found at my community that was a highly successful means of shifting this was focusing on community building. And we all call ourselves communities, but we know very, very, very little about how do you actually build community. And so just, a couple things that hit me as I was studying community building, because there's a whole area of research on this and skills that we need to build, but is to think about what happens in our communities where we focus on the people that live in our communities, the residents, as consumers. And there is a huge difference between being a citizen of a community and being a consumer. So citizens know that they are part of the solution. They have a role to play. They have an impact on their community, and there are expectations when you are a citizen of how you will behave and what norms there are and things like that. Consumers, on the other hand, become helpless and self-entitled. So I don't like what's happening at this community. I can't fix it. I need to go to the executive director to fix these problems. And I'm convinced this is one of our big underlying issues we have in a lot of our organizations is we see the people that live in these communities as consumers. The other thing is, so we need to call people back to being citizens to drive this change that we're talking about with creating acceptance and inclusivity. The other thing is to think about what the leader's role is. And, you know, I always used to think my job was to be like a manager of a resort or a hotel. And, you know, I fix the problems. Come to me and I shall take care of things. And what I've learned is that being a community leader is a much different thing. And this is where the power comes from. So if you think about your role, if you are the leader of a community, as almost like being a mayor. And one of my friends used to say her job as an executive director in a retirement community was like being a mayor. A mayor's job is not to solve every problem. A mayor's job is to develop and support the infrastructure of that community, and then to bring out the best in everybody that lives there and to build the social fabric of the community. So that's the framework that we found really worked with this. And so what we're talking about here, there's a saying that all change is linguistic. So this isn't about, okay, I was on this webinar and I'm going to go back and write a new policy and procedure and that's how we're going to drive this change. All change is linguistic means that everything is about conversation and people coming together and talking about it and driving change that way. It's about community learning. And the leader's job is not to have the right answers, but to ask the right questions. And I'm going to share a few sample questions with you that you can go back and use in your community. And the goal is shared commitment to creating a new reality there. So it's a powerful formula that we found really worked, is education plus conversation equals transformation. So I would bring in education. I would talk to people about, hey, let's do some education on ageism and ableism. Let's talk about what the impact, what the research shows the impact of this is on people. And then let's talk about it. And then let's talk about, now we all start to understand this, let's talk about how we're going to start to transform this. So this, again, I would keep this formula in mind as you move forward with your work in this realm. And what we really want to do is create norms of inclusivity. So there are norms everywhere in our society, and we live according to the norms. So we know when we go to the store and we go to check out, if there are people standing in line in front of us, we don't cut to the front of the line. We know what's expected and we stand in line as we're supposed to. We know that we're supposed to act a different way in the library than we are in a bar. And so working with your community to create healthy norms of inclusivity is critical, because right now I'm guessing in a lot of communities there are some norms that maybe are not that good for the overall health of the community and people feeling like they're included. Like people who, maybe you have assigned seats in your dining room, and sometimes when people don't even have assigned seats, the folks will say, well, this is my table with my 3 friends and that's it. And somebody else will come to sit down and they say, this seat's taken. And so that's just an example of, you know, those kinds of things really destroy community. So it's working with the folks that work in your community to create new norms. And so, so here's some things that I suggest to organizations, and you can download these slides and be able to kind of take these back and think about them, but just go through and do like an assessment of your community and where you are with ageism and ableism and inclusivity, which is really what we're talking about. So have you educated people about ageism and ableism? How do you refer to the different levels of living and the people who need support? Do you have, I've been at communities where the nursing home is down the hill from the independent living, and they call it, you go down the hill, it's down there. Do you call people dementia residents rather than putting the person first? Even independent living, is that the right word to use? So looking at those words, as we know, words make worlds, can give you a lot of clues into your current culture. Do you have policies and practices that are encouraging segregation and ostracism in your community? Do you use your common area spaces to encourage or discourage inclusivity? So in my community, we used to have the separate, this is where independent living people go for community life programs, and this is where the nursing home goes. And we just changed it all up, and everything was spread out throughout the community, so that not only were people brought together for programs, but the people who lived in apartment homes were regularly going to the nursing home for programs. And so it starts to reduce some of that stigma around the different levels of living. Is there a noticeable difference in the decor and maintenance and the different levels of living? Are there norms of inclusion in place? What messages are you sending through your marketing and your advertising? And do you educate about inclusivity during tours? So this is one of the things that we made a very strong focus for us when we were going through all this work at my community. We had built a lot of new apartment homes that were quite expensive, and we were really like, okay, maybe we can get some, active folks in here, and some new people coming in, and so there were some people who were worried that people wouldn't want to move into a place where they would be around people in wheelchairs. And what we found is we made it a selling point, and we would talk to people about, when they come on tours, we would first of all show everybody every part of the campus. And we would talk about the fact that everybody in that community is honored and included, regardless of their abilities or what challenges they're living with. And people loved it. We were at like 99% occupancy within 9 months of opening those apartment homes. It drew people in. So other things you can do, learning circles. And if you don't use learning circles right now, there are resources on the Pioneer Network website about how to do them. But some questions that you can use. This is great to use with the folks that live in your community, is asking that question, what kind of community do we want to be? How do we want people to live here to feel? And people, nobody's going to say we want this to be a place where people don't feel welcomed or they feel awful about themselves. They're going to talk about the kind of culture that's inclusive. And so getting those conversations on the table really starts to help to drive change. Asking people, have you ever experienced being treated differently because of your age or your different abilities? Have you ever felt ostracized or left out of a group? How did it make you feel? Can really bring people back to understanding the way that maybe their behavior is having other people feel. This was a really interesting conversation. In your past, have you worked with others to include and honor people living with different abilities? And we had a number of folks who came from education backgrounds who had driven the inclusivity of kids who live with different abilities into classrooms with everyone else. And so that brought them back to, gosh, this is how we taught kids to behave. And then other residents started talking about, well, I taught my kids to be kind to other people who were different. And so it really helped, it calls people back to the kind of person they want to be. And then just talking about how might it be impacting me and others in my community. So some success stories we had at my community when we really started driving this change so just a couple there were a lot of great things, but our community life director at the time summed it up really perfectly. And she said, once people started knowing each other for who they are as human beings, they stopped defining each other by their disabilities. And so we had just amazing things start to happen where people would go on outings together, not based on where they lived in the community, but who loves art. If they were going to do an art in the park outing or go to a museum or whatever, people came together based on what they love versus what challenges they're living with. There was because of these new norms of inclusivity, I remember there was a resident who lived in our nursing home who she had to use a special wheelchair, and she had contractures, and normally she would probably be ostracized, but she would come over to the bistro in the part of the building where a lot of folks from independent living would dine, and she would come into that dining room and everybody would say, come sit with me, come sit with me. And people just went out of their way to welcome people and make them feel supported and loved. And the residents started asking for education about dementia so they could support their friends and neighbors. There was another example. I had a group of residents come to me one time and say, well, we've got this bridge game going, and I'll call her Sue, who lives in the memory support neighborhood, can't keep up with us in bridge. And in the past, Sue would have been really, basically, people would say Sue can't play bridge with us anymore. But the folks wanted Sue to feel good and be involved. And so they had to start another bridge game. One was for people who wanted to play really fast and not, ever have to slow down. And then the other group was could play a little bit slower, and Sue could successfully continue to play bridge with that group. So great things can happen from all of this. And we are almost out of time here, but I did want to close out with some success stories, in that things really can change. And it's all going back to community building and bringing people together and working with the people that live in your community to develop those new norms and to develop the community culture that you really want to see there. So if we're going to open it up for questions in a minute, but I did want to put out there, if you need help with this, the Eden Alternative is available for educational resources. We do consulting work in this area. My email address is on the screen here, and you feel free to reach out to me directly. And then I've a book that has just been published that I put out. It's really all about, the undertone is how ageism and ableism impact everything in our communities. And there's a whole chapter in the book on addressing what we just talked about today. So Penny, I am going to turn it, and the book is available from the Pioneer website and also the Eden Alternative website, and it's also available from Health Professions Press and on Amazon. Penny, I'm going to turn it back over to you to see. I'd like to hear questions that anybody has, and also if people have thoughts or ideas on how they've addressed this in their communities.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. And everyone, please use the chat box, or feel free to use the Q&A box as well, and type in your questions. If you'd like to raise your hand, I should be able to unmute you as well. And we do have a comment question in the Q&A box, Jill, from Leah Jansen. Do you have suggestions for language or phrasing for delicately and directly holding older adults accountable when you hear them say something ageist or ableist?
So one of the things I want to start to answer that question with is, once you get this moving, is you will not have to be the one who's addressing it, because the people that live in the community will feel so strongly about it that they will work with each other. And if there's a situation that can't be resolved, we have an absolute it's really a moral imperative. We have got to address this. And so I would, sit down and probably talk with someone about, how, and maybe ask some of those questions that I posed to ask in a learning circle, but you can ask someone that directly, like, hey, have you ever had somebody treat you in a way that made you feel like you weren't valuable? How did that make you feel? And start a conversation that way. I will say, even though the vast majority of people in my community, and what I've seen in other places, really, really engage with this, there will always be a couple people. And that's, you know, it happens with everything we try to change. And people who absolutely refuse to get on board with this or are doing harm to other people, it has to be addressed. And I've actually had people who say, I don't want to move in if that's the way this is going to be. It was very few. And I've also had to have conversations with people that we don't do, this is not our culture. And we cannot have people made to feel that way. And, you know, but that was really rare, because the powerful thing is if people's peers call them on it. So I would sit down and engage in a conversation and ask questions. Start with questions.
Thanks so much, Jill. We have another question from Julie Walker. Where do you suggest to start this process in turning culture?
So if I would go, so what I would do is, and what we did is we started doing education about ageism and ableism and conversations. And so what I did, and this isn't about the leader just standing up and, you know, pontificating in front of everyone. This is about, like, I broke down our monthly resident meetings into smaller ones where we would sit in a circle. And I would bring up, and so maybe I would have like 30 people at a time versus all, you know, however many hundreds of people. And it seems like it takes a lot of time, but this is, in the long run, this is how you drive change, at least what I found. And I would bring up a topic. Like I would bring in an article about ageism or one of those stories from New York Times. And then so I would do some education, and then I would ask a learning circle question, and we would get conversation going. So that's where I would start, education, but not leaving it at that. Then find the time, make the space, be intentional about those community conversations.
Thanks so much, Jill. Do we have other questions or comments? Jill, I know that you wanted to hear from our attendees about some of their thoughts regarding this as well.
That would be wonderful.
So if anyone would like to type that into the chat or the question and answer, or raise your hand and I can unmute you. In the meantime, Jill, I have to say, and this is going to be my plug for your book. I had the opportunity to read your book already, and I just thought that it really was almost a continuation of what we've been talking about. And one of the things that you offer is so many real life examples of the experiences that you've had along the way. And what I really appreciated is they were both positive and negative, because I think it takes the negative sometimes for us to learn and really start to do things differently. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, you know, when I was writing the book, I really reflected on a lot of the mistakes that I made, and there were a lot of them. And the fact that if we're really going to drive change, we're going to make mistakes, and we have to say, and this can be a hard thing sometimes, is to look at the way you've been doing something as a leader and say, ooh, this might not be the best way, and then to shift and continue learning and continue growing. That's the only way. I mean, leaders continue to grow and continue to learn. And the other thing I'll just throw out there is, when we're talking about community, which is what this is really all about, is really becoming highly skilled community builders. Community's messy, and it's never perfect. You're never going to have this utopia of everyone being wonderful to each other, because, I mean, think about the community where you live. It's not like that. All your neighbors don't get along, right? There are always problems. It's working toward, you know, improvement. So it's us as leaders being able, willing, open to looking at things in a new way, and also our organization. So creating, you know, that learning organization where it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to even have failures, as long as it's teaching you something and you're moving ahead.
Well, that's what I found from your book as well. So thank you for that. I want to open it up one last time if there's any other questions or comments from our attendees. Okay, well, just a few things to close things out. Jill, thank you so much for being here today, for really helping us think more about this information in our own communities, in our senior living communities, about ageism and ableism, and giving us those practical ideas of how we can start this process or how we can continue to do what we're already doing for education. I really appreciate that. And to our attendees, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to join us today. And we'd love your feedback on the webinar. A link to a short survey was included in the email you received prior to the webinar, and you'll also find that link in an email that you'll get around 24 hours after the close of the webinar. That will also contain the webinar recording link, the handouts, and a certificate of completion. The recording will also be available on the Pioneer Network website under the Ageism tab on our resource library page. So while sharing the vision series is a great way to start the conversation, we also know that there's knowledge and information about practical application that we all need as we're on our culture change journey. And so we hope that you'll join us for our Growing Person-Centeredness webinar series. The September webinar will feature guides Lynn Snow and Christine Hartman, and the topic will be watch list huddling, a high engagement, proactive quality practice. Jill, can you turn to our next slide? To find out more information about the Hot Topic webinars and just to stay connected with Pioneer Network and to receive our newsletter and other information, feel free to go to the Pioneer Network website at www.pioneernetwork.net and look under the Events tab. Again, thank you so much, Jill, and to each of you for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.